Test. 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 Chelsea, I see your question. We'll be able to get to that easily. I'll just give it another minute. Sorry, my office is a mess, and so I'm trying to track down something to write with too in case we need it. All right, guys, I think we're ready to get going. If anybody else jumps in, this is all being recorded, so we'll be able to help you out if you've got any sort of questions. You can watch it later on. But then also, if you have any questions pop up during the review session, just pop them onto the right-hand side so I'm able to check them there. But I'll be looking down your Schoology list. I also had students who will remain unnamed who wanted me to keep their names anonymous when I was reading questions. And so I promised to do that. And if I slip up, I'm truly sorry. I'm not trying to call out anybody or make you feel awkward or whatever. So we'll get started with the questions that I have. Period 1 does not have any questions, and so I'm excited to see how great they do on the test tomorrow. So I'm going to start off with period 2. And so the first question that I see for period 2 is asking about the book Other People's Money and How Bankers Should Use It by Louis Brandeis. And the question is asking about the issues with the banks. They're similar to what Wilson wanted to reform, and is it important to know this specific book? This is not on the level of like an Uncle Tom's Cabin or Alfred Mahan or something like that. Louis Brandeis, though, is important, though, because he is going to be one of Woodrow Wilson's most famous appointments to the Supreme Court. He is our first Jewish Supreme Court justice. He is somebody so he's going to break a glass barrier there, where in the past there was a lot of suspicion towards Jewish people in the United States, and we have a wave of anti-Semitism going on. Louis Brandeis, though, is a really successful lawyer who is going to write a book during the time period to break down with scientific evidence what was going on with the banking industry and how they were doing things to try to figure out ways to hide money. He was also demonstrating what's going on with monopolies. And so when we talked previously, we had talked about the fact that with a monopoly, we discussed how a monopoly would have businesses that they would own, but then we also talked about how they would build trust to figure out ways to avoid lawsuits. One of the things that he's highlighting, which we talked about around the time of break, but it was really quick and we covered a lot of business stuff, is we talked about the idea of holding companies. And what that means is with a holding company, you might set up your business in a state like New Jersey, where New Jersey is not interested in doing any sort of reforms or cracking down on monopolies. So a monopoly owner might build their home base for their company in New Jersey so they could avoid taxes or regulations or other sorts of things. And that's what Louis Brandeis is exposing. He is working as almost like a muckraker with a book of his that's trying to expose how bad the banking and monopoly systems are and talking about how they should be reformed. And then that leads to his court case, Mueller versus Oregon, where he is going to try to put into place a lawsuit that will allow the state of Oregon to put maximum work hour limits on women because of the fact that they're going to claim that as women, they have duties of being mothers and wives and those sorts of things. They're going to have a very chauvinistic argument for why the state should be able to do maximum hour laws. But by using that argument, he is going to be able to win this court case to be able to then get women better work conditions. We're going to find, though, and this is where I saw another question about this in another class period. There was a question that was asking about the court case that's inside your textbook, Lochner versus Oregon. This is from my period 4 class. And Lochner versus Oregon is going to overturn some of the ideas of Mueller versus Oregon. So in Mueller versus Oregon, the Supreme Court argued that while businesses should be able to run themselves as they want to, there were limits when it came to concerns about safety and public health for women. What you'll find, though, is that there's a battle that's still going on nowadays when it comes to the idea of labor unions. And one of the things that conservatives will say is that a labor union is unfairly rigging the negotiation process by threatening to do things like strikes or other sorts of things. And one of the arguments that's made in the late 1800s is that the 14th Amendment, which was created for African Americans, is also something that should be seen as a limitation on how much the federal government can get involved in business, with the idea that if each person is a citizen, a business owner and a worker should be able to negotiate one-on-one in order to figure out what their contracts are going to be. And the argument is that the 14th Amendment limits what the federal government can do to interfere, and that the business owners should then have not very many limitations on what they can do for bosses. Sophia, that's me. Why are you doing that? All right. I don't know who you're talking about. So what's going to be happening during this time period is there's going to be a feeling with the progressives that they need to redo the Supreme Court with more liberal justices to try to maintain the progressive reforms that they're putting into place, rather than having them be undone by the Supreme Court a couple of years after a law or a court case gets taken care of. The next question I have for period 2 is asking, what are the turning points for World War I? And so what I would consider for World War I is we're looking at the American side. Next year, when you take world history, you're going to be studying the European side, which will be taking a look at all the different aspects, East and Western Front. But when you think about Germany in World War I, there's going to be a toppling of all these alliances where you have Serbia to the south of Austria-Hungary. They'll go to war. Germany is Austria-Hungary's teammate. They'll go to war with Serbia. Serbia's ally is Russia. When Germany and Russia go to war, then France and England jump in on Russia's side. And Germany is now trapped between two countries, Russia to the west, England and France to the west, Russia to the east. When we think about the turning points of the war, then, the start is Archduke Ferdinand's assassination and the falling apart of all these alliances. During the war, then, you want to know about the trench warfare that was shown to you in the video lecture, where you've got warfare that really bogs down. All those weapons that we've been talking about with like the new rifles from the Civil War, they've been augmented by now machine guns. and poison gas. They're using barbed wire to not keep out cattle, but keep out human beings. And with the trenches, they extend for miles and they're almost impenetrable, especially if you've seen a movie like 1917 that's in the movie theater now, or Wonder Woman that was a couple of years ago. What we'll find, though, is the big turning point. These are the big turning points. 1915, the Lusitania. You have an English ship that goes across the ocean that is warned by the Germans, don't go across the ocean, we're going to blow you up, because they suspected that in the belly of this passenger ship, they're storing weapons and ammunition to sneak them through the German blockade. England had been blocking supplies going to Germany. Germany's U-boats were blowing up ships going to England. And in particular, what the Germans were mad about is that America claimed that they were neutral, but we were trying to send weapons and food to England, France, and Germany. But whenever we get close to Germany, the British would intercept our ships, nicely escort them to Britain, buy the materials off of us, send back empty ships. And that's why the U-boats are blowing ships up. So in 1915, the Lusitania gets blown up with 100-some Americans on the boat. And Woodrow Wilson is so nervous about war, especially because he's running for re-election and nobody in the country is really super excited about ending isolation. And so he's going to promise that he's going to keep us out of war. You should then know the term the Sussex Pledge. After a few more ships are blown up, one of them called the Sussex, the Germans agreed to stop torpedoing ships that were American or British that might be carrying Americans, for fear that they might drag the United States into the war. As you read chapter 29, then it's very important to notice what's going on with Mexico. And they do it kind of in a disjointed sort of way. You just outed yourself. What are you doing? So Mexico is going to be seen as a corrupt power by Woodrow Wilson because they have a coup that takes out their leader. When America invades Mexico, and I saw somebody asking about the Tampico incident. The Tampico incident is going to be a skirmish between Americans and Mexicans, and Woodrow Wilson is going to use that as an excuse to invade Veracruz and try to put pressure onto the Mexican government. When Mexico starts looking around for friends, one of the friends they start looking to is Germany, who starts sending them weapons and supplies. And that's going to be the tension that we have between 1915 and 1917, is we're not certain what Mexico's up to. We don't know what's happening in Europe. Your biggest turning point, though, is 1917. And in 1917, a guy named Vladimir Lenin is going to be exiled from Russia. He's going to convince the Germans to put him onto a train. And when he goes back to Russia, he leads the Russian Revolution. Russia becomes communist. America tries to send troops there to put down the communist revolution, and they fail. And so Russia is going to pull themselves out of the war because of the fact that they're hoping that they can then focus on themselves and rebuilding. In World War I, they were also mad because you had poor people sent off to war to fight for the rich. And they were oftentimes not sent into war with either weapons or ammunition. Sometimes multiple people would be sent towards the enemies with the instructions that if one person fell, you could pick up their gun, but otherwise you're running in unarmed. So when Russia quit the war in 1917, it has a couple different things that take place. Number one, we're going to have a Red Scare in the United States. We're afraid of communism in the period right after we get done with World War I. Bigger picture, though, Germany can now throw all their forces in England and France. So 1917 is key because when Russia leaves the war, England and France are about to lose. And at that same moment, Germany does two things that makes America mad. One's called the Zimmerman Note. They send a note to Mexico that gets intercepted by the British that offers Mexico a deal if they join Germany in a war against the United States and distract the Americans. Then Germany, after the World War I is done, will help Mexico regain California, New Mexico, Arizona, the Southwest. The other thing the Germans do is they reopen U-boat attacks, and so they start attacking American ships because they're hoping if they just stop supplies for a little bit of time, Germany can sweep through France, take over Western Europe, and then they'll be able to win World War I. America's arrival is going to be the key turning point for World War I. There is not a specific battle that you need to know for a survey course in U.S. history. More importantly, though, when the Germans fall, because we start using tanks and flamethrowers and other sorts of things to break through the lines, you really need to know about the 14 points in the Treaty of Versailles, where Wilson has his 14 points plan. And the Treaty of Versailles is what we go with instead. That's going to punish Germany severely and lead us towards World War II. So sorry about the long-winded answer. I think I wove a number of different questions into there from period two. So hopefully that did okay. Feel free to do follow-ups over on the right-hand side. And Sophia, I'm going to totally get to the list of what specific people you need to know to do well on your AP tests, because I know that that's a struggle for you. Oh, I almost slipped. Oh, the last question for period two. Can I explain Wilsonian idealism? Woodrow Wilson is a progressive who's also an academic. And if you've ever heard people be critical of people who teach, where they'll say things like "those who can't do teach," that's an argument that's made about how academic people being removed from the real world don't understand how the real world works. So Woodrow Wilson's progressivism is with the idea of like his new freedom, where he's talking about the idea of like making the government big, wiping out all monopolies, and then afterwards shrinking the government and shrinking the monopoly sizes. Once he becomes president, he starts to realize the job's more complicated, and wiping out all the monopolies would be hard to win World War I, and it'd be incredibly disruptive. You're going to see that then also when it comes to World War I, where Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, they're laughable when you get to World War I, just like they're laughable when you think about our war or peace game. So inside of our class, he would have argued that we should not be doing secret alliances. We should not be building up our militaries to attack one another. We should all just be friendly to one another, and just try to maintain peace without any sort of victories or taunting of the opposite side. And what Woodrow Wilson doesn't seem to understand is in Europe, it's a different dynamic. It's different when you've got multiple powerful countries living right on top of one another. You can't just say, let's all be friends, because you might leave yourself then vulnerable to future attacks. So in England and France's minds, they want to very much punish Germany and defeat them severely so they stop being a threat. Because previously, before Germany united, they were just a series of nation states in the old Holy Roman Empire that weren't really threatening to anybody at the beginning of our textbook. So that's why they're talking about Wilsonian idealism. He's a little bit naive about what he thinks he can accomplish. And then at the end of the war, he's a little bit naive about what he can do as the president, because he doesn't want to compromise with the Republicans in Congress to get the Treaty of Versailles done, where the Treaty of Versailles is going to tell Germany, all the countries in Europe, that if there's ever a war, America's going to jump in on the side of the people in the League of Nations who get attacked. This new alliance system that we're now getting sucked into makes conservatives like the Republicans and the Southern Democrats really super nervous that we're ignoring the advice from George Washington. And so that's going to be something that causes the people of Congress to reject that. I see, Sophia, your question, how does the 14 points differ from the Treaty of Versailles? The list that I just rattled off, that you should be able to freely travel the seas, no secret alliances being permitted. We want to reduce the military size of everybody in the countries in Europe, give colonies self-determination, create a League of Nations. That's Woodrow Wilson's idea. When he proposes those at the Treaty of Versailles, that's a palace that's just outside of Paris. The Treaty of Versailles is created by England and France. And the reason why, I'm not sure what "do the star" means, Sophia, I'm sorry. When we think about what's going on with the British then, they're the ones who are proposing ideas where they need to cripple Germany in order to make themselves feel safer in Europe. What they'll do then is they'll start including these characteristics. They want the Treaty of Versailles to take away Germany's armies, except for leaving like a small defensive army, get rid of all of their navy, most of their air force. They're going to lose chunks of land to France and neighboring countries, where they'll carve out Poland and other places from what used to be Germany. They're going to cut Austria and Hungary into two countries rather than having them together. And the worst part is they're going to tell the Germans, you must accept blame for World War I, even though they're not at fault completely for the war. And then secondarily, they must pay reparations. They must pay back the British and the French for all the money they spent fighting the war, as well as paying back their own debts. Now, the reason why Germany is so mad is they quit the war in 1918 because they listened to Woodrow Wilson talking about peace without victory, making the world safe for democracy, war to end all wars. So they get suckered in, where their military starts drifting away when their final advance fails. The Germans come to Versailles, then they get locked in a side room, and then the British, after the Treaty of Versailles is done, they bring the Germans in and they tell them, you're not getting what Wilson promised. You're getting something that's a lot more punitive. What they were also told is since the German army melted away, the British and the French threatened to invade Germany if the Germans didn't agree to this. So in 1918, 1919, Germany is forced to accept a treaty surrender that's going to end the war technically, but it's going to create a lot of hostility with people who are nationalistic. And if you hear the name Nazi, that's nationalism is a piece of what they're founded on. And it's going to very much irritate Adolf Hitler, who is going to start pushing forward with attempts to try to rebuild Germany. And that leads us into World War II. So hopefully I did okay with those. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to help you out with that. I'm refreshing period 2. And I don't see any other questions on the period 2 page. Period 1 still empty. Period 4. Let me see here. I see a question asking, why does an income tax system not work with a tariff system? Or rather, what is the major differences between the two? First of all, we do have a combination of a tariff and an income tax system nowadays. We're kind of living in weird times where the Republicans, after the 1920s, they're going to become the party of free trade. So many Republicans following the period of the Great Depression are going to argue against tariffs, and tariffs are going to become a democratic idea for a period of time to protect American workers. But if you've been paying attention to the news for the past 3 years, we do have income taxes, both state and federal now, but we also have brand new tariffs that President Trump created in an attempt to try to get into a trade war with China that he said was going to be very easy for us to win. Those have been going on for a few years. And there are many Americans who are troubled because when you put tariffs on foreign country stuff, like you've learned in our class, those are taxes that are paid by Americans, and they hurt poorer Americans more than they hurt wealthy Americans. So the way to think about them is a tariff is a tax on foreign goods that everybody has to pay when you buy foreign products. So it might be something where they add like a nickel of tax onto a item that's coming from China. And then when you buy that product from that company, you're paying for the product, but then the company is also going to roll that tax into the price of the product, and the price should go up. There are two different types of tariffs. One's called a revenue tariff, where you keep it low enough that people will still buy the product, and that generates cash for your country. The other type of tariff, though, is a protective tariff, and that's what we saw building throughout the 1800s from the time of Henry Clay's American system, and that's what you especially see as you move through the late 1800s and early 1900s. The protective tariff would sometimes get high, like into the double digits by quite a lot, which would make it very expensive to buy from European countries. And the big problem that many Americans had is twofold. One, when you wanted to buy stuff, the European stuff was already so expensive, which then created a safe place in the United States for monopolies. So like Andrew Carnegie's steel monopoly couldn't really exist as easily as it did if you could buy British steel tax-free. But instead, they kept the tax high. And the idea was you protect the American business, you then protect American jobs. The American people pay a little bit more because they don't have competition, but all of those jobs staying in America then helps out our economy. In the late 1800s, though, the farmers started pushing, and they said that the tariffs are really hard for poor people because whether you're dirt poor or you're super rich, you pay the same amount of tax. And they were pointing out there are some people in the country who didn't have any money to scratch together during the panics of 1873, 83, 93, 1907. So the idea was created to instead go towards a graduated income tax. And what that meant is that we'll get our revenue then from income taxes, where the lowest chunk of the population won't pay anything. And then as you move up into different pockets of money, those pockets get taxed at higher and higher rates. With the idea then that if you are poor in the United States, you don't need taxes to grind you down, and you can't really contribute much anyways. But if you're wealthy, you're doing okay already, and you can afford to then be able to help out with what's happening in the country. For many conservatives, though, they get very mad about this restructuring of the tax code because, like you learned in your Steel Empire game, you had plans for that money when you were thinking about building up monopolies or investing it. And if you think about social Darwinism, there are many wealthy people who thought that the poor were genetically bad anyways, and so giving them money wasn't something that was seen as worthwhile. So when we think about the income tax system and the tariffs, That's been a debate that we've had ever since the early 1900s. Recently, President Trump cut our income taxes, especially for wealthy Americans. And so he's very much showing the same sort of viewpoint that conservatives had in the early 1900s, that we should let the wealthy keep more of their money so they could invest it rather than have it be wasted by the government. There are progressives who are arguing, though, that we should increase taxes on the wealthy to get things done and to reduce our debt. So this is one of the debates that you're walking into. Finn, I see your question. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to name names. Sorry about that. Could I explain the League of Nations? The League of Nations is meant to be an organization that is very similar to our modern United Nations. And in fact, the United Nations replaced the League of Nations when it failed between World War I and World War II. This was planned by Woodrow Wilson with his 14 points plan. And unfortunately, what happened with the League of Nations is when Woodrow Wilson brought back the Treaty of Versailles, the Republicans in Congress hated the League of Nations and the stipulation that if any country in the League was attacked, America would then have to jump into that war. So it was super embarrassing because Woodrow Wilson came back totally confident that the American people would back him up. And when he came home, he couldn't get the American people to convince Republicans to back down. Some Republicans were asking Woodrow Wilson to compromise and make that involvement part less, so that we could join the League of Nations but not jump into future wars if we didn't like them. And then Woodrow Wilson had a massive stroke while he was trying to get the treaty passed. And so as a result, we never joined the League of Nations. And it was super embarrassing to that organization because everybody in Europe understood Germany was destroyed. England and France had been ruined. Their economies were a mess. Russia became communist. The only country that could really come in and bring order back to that area and bring wealth to help out with that was the United States. And instead, what the United States is going to do is they're not going to join the League of Nations. They're going to pull back and become isolationist, and that's going to allow the rise of dictatorships, whether it's in communist Russia, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy. We're going to have an emperor in Japan who becomes aggressive. And that's all happening because we leave a void where we don't really join in to actually help reorder what had been destroyed afterwards. Graham, when it comes to the Bolshevik Revolution, hopefully my explanation about the communist revolution in Russia, how it created a one-front war for Germany. They could throw all of their forces at England and France. And America's arrival was brought on partially because of the Zimmerman Note, partially because of U-boat attacks, partially because England and France owed America gobs of cash that they had borrowed to fight the war. And if they fell, they'd never repay that money. So for a combination of different reasons, America goes off to war because of the revolution, where Germany now doesn't have to fight on two fronts. The next question I see, and I'm sorry about calling out who posted that question. Hopefully you're not offended. I see the next question was about holding companies. So hopefully you got that answer as we first started off our review session. Let me see here. The next question, can I explain why Germany targeted the United States in World War I and the court case of Lochner versus New York? So like I mentioned with Germany, they're fearful of the United States. Our factories are booming, especially during the Gilded Age. And so if we got involved in the war effort, not just sending supplies, but also soldiers, that would be a decisive turning point. So that's why Germany cut back their U-boat attacks in 1915. It's also why they created the Zimmerman Note and increased the U-boat attacks after Russia's communist revolution, with the idea that if they could win quickly and distract America with Mexico, they might be able to then win World War I and take over all of Western Europe. The court case Lochner versus New York, like we mentioned just a little bit ago, that was a court case that invalidated the idea that a state could create maximum work hours or get involved in minimum wages. And so we're going to see progressive reform during the Wilson time get slowed down by the Supreme Court, who feels like those issues should be local issues between business owners and their workers. They're saying that it's not a national issue and it's not a state issue. It's just a contract issue between two parties. What progressives are going to argue, though, is that those two parties are highly imbalanced. The idea that a one individual worker could stand up to a JP Morgan and demand a pay raise and demand satisfaction When in actuality, that person is going to be told no. And then when they go on strike, they're going to get crushed, and the police are going to come in and force them back to work. And the progressives are making the argument during this time that there should be something not to create communism and socialism, but something that would balance out the negotiating battlefield. Let me take a look and see if we've got any other here. And then Chelsea, I promise I will come back to the question that you posted. See nothing for more for period 4, nothing more for period 2, nothing more for period 1. So let me backtrack here. Okay. So Chelsea, your question is asking about, let me see here. How did the Underwood Tariff Act reflect Wilson's progressive goals? So there are 2 tariffs from this chapter that you need to know about. One of them is the Payne-Aldrich tariff, and it's part of the reason why William Howard Taft got voted out of office. William Howard Taft was in a really tough spot because in the Republican Party, you had stalwarts that were very conservative, and they were the people who wanted no reforms, no change, keep the tariffs high, protect businesses. But you also had reformers like Teddy Roosevelt's progressives that are eventually going to split off and create the Bull Moose Party because they're so fed up with William Howard Taft. So what they wanted to do is you had super high tariffs coming out of the 1800s. When you think about like the McKinley tariff that we learned about at the end of the 1800s, tariffs were sky high. And what they wanted to do is progressives were trying to cut tariffs because at the same time they passed the 16th Amendment, which was giving people the right, they were giving the United States the power to collect income taxes. And so with that combination, the idea was you're going to keep your money levels equal, but you're just going to collect your taxes in a different way, not from tariffs, but instead from income tax. The problem, though, is with the Payne-Aldrich tariff, you had income taxes that were up, but then with the Payne-Aldrich tariff, Taft tried to cut tariffs on all these products, and all of these business people came to the White House and came to the Capitol, and they kept going to politicians and saying, look, I know you want to cut the tariff, but just don't do it with my business. Don't do it with like steel or oil or tropical fruit or whatever. And so eventually they took a tariff that was here, and progressives want to cut it down to here, and they only cut it like this. And on some items, they actually see the tariff creep up a little bit because of all the lobbying that's taking place. So it's this action that's going to really make people who are progressive mad at William Howard Taft, on top of other things like when he's trying to sell off national park lands and fires Gifford Pinchot. But this is really a big one. So when Woodrow Wilson comes in office, he feels like he's got the permission from the United States people to do the Underwood tariff. And the Underwood tariff takes the Payne-Aldrich tariff and cuts it severely, with the idea that this will then free up trade. We could then trade with other countries and they could trade with us. This is part of our diplomacy with dollar diplomacy, trying to trade with Latin American countries as well, while we still have tariff protections going on. But the idea is we cut tariffs, increase income taxes, and we're collecting our money in different ways. And for progressives, this seems like a more fair way rather than charging a tariff that everybody pays equally, rich or poor. This is making a concession that if you are wealthier, you are probably better prepared to be able to pay taxes. Conservatives, though, are going to call this socialism, communism, a redistribution of wealth, because of all the reasons we've discussed in the past with the Steel Empire game and all the stuff that you're aware of. They've got plans for that money too. Sophia, I see your question posted here. What do we need to know about the Mexican Revolution? Did you already talk about the Tampico incident? I did, but I can be real quick about reviewing that again. For the Mexican Revolution, that's going to be a world history thing more than a U.S. history thing. But essentially what happened is from the time of 1821, Mexico had the potential of doing like the United States did. The problem is they kept having people interfere in their affairs, and that's kind of destabilized their country. They're situated in a place also where they've got the areas that are boundaried by like desert to the north, that separated them into 2 livable areas, which made it very easy during the Mexican-American War to peel off California, New Mexico, Arizona. But during the Civil War, you learned about Maximilian, who came from with the aid of France to take over Mexico as a possession. And they go through a series of civil wars. And at this point, during the Wilson presidency, we have a coup that takes place, and a military dictator took over in Mexico. And Woodrow Wilson felt like this indicated that they were a morally bad country. And so he decided he was going to put pressure onto Mexico to try to get them to become democratic and engage in capitalism. The thing that your textbook doesn't emphasize all that well, though, is whenever you read about these interventions for Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, the taking of Hawaii, and whatever, our textbook regularly leaves out the idea that there are American business people who are already involved in business in these areas, and they were trying to figure out ways to make wealth off of these places. And when they become unstable, oftentimes the Americans would plead to the United States government for assistance, like you saw with the USS Maine when it came to Cuba. So in Mexico, the United States starts putting pressure onto the new government in Mexico. And we had the Tampico incident where the Mexican military started harassing the American military, and it led to the invasion by the United States Marines into Veracruz. If you have ever heard the Marine Corps song where they sing about from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, Tripoli is the one that you learned about with Jefferson, where we had the Barbary pirates. Montezuma is the Aztecs, and that's Mexico City. And so they're talking about the idea of the Mexican-American War. And we're also taking a look at the impact that we have here, where we're going into Mexico as well. So we're going to invade Mexico for a period of time. And like we talked about with World War I causes, this is why Mexico's negotiating with Germany, why they're trying to make friends with them, why Germany's sending weapons to Mexico. And this is why we get so mad about the Zimmerman note, because Germany was trying to egg Mexico on to start a war with the United States on the southern boundary. So we would send our troops there instead of Europe, and that would let Germany win World War I. Hopefully that helps. Aaron, I see your question, Working Men's Compensation Act. This initially was only applying to certain subsects of jobs, but what this is going to do is it's going to lead to workman's comp. And if you ever work a job, you'll notice that when you punch into the time clock, you'll find a bulletin board right next to where you're clocking in. And that bulletin board has a bunch of government posters on it that are all products of the ideas from the progressive era, with the idea that you can run your business and we're not going to have a communist takeover of the United States businesses. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create rules and regulations that tell you you can run your business, but you also have a duty to maintain safety. And what that Working Men's Compensation Act is going to be including is the idea that if you get injured on the job, and it's not your fault, but it's an unsafe workplace, then it's the business's job to try to get you back to being healthy rather than just firing you and replacing you with a different worker. Sophia, I said other people's names because they've got them over here on the side scroll, but I was really bad about that tonight. I multiple times almost said people's names. It looks like I've exhausted all the questions that I have for tonight. I'm going to do one final scroll through here. I will also keep an eye on that message board on the side of the stream, but hopefully you're feeling good for the test tomorrow. Since I don't see any other questions, I'm going to assume that we're done for tonight. Like I mentioned to you in class, tonight is going to be really interesting because of the fact that we've got a State of the Union address happening tonight, while the president still technically has an impeachment that is waiting for him in the Senate. But the votes are virtually guaranteed that the president is not going to be facing any sort of legal trouble. Sophia, what people do you need to know? The only person I would spend a lot of time focusing on is just Eugene V. Debs. It just devote hours to the leader of the socialist movement, who is going to spend time in jail because of the fact that he, during the war, contributed, I believe, a quarter to the anti-war effort and told people not to enlist, and that earned him a sentence of a decade in jail. And a pretty sizable fine, and he still ran for president from his jail cell and got nearly a million votes in the 1920 election for it. It's kind of interesting. But everybody else is, you can just leave them out, and I'm being sarcastic. There's not a ton of names in this chapter, and I think that your question is legit from the standpoint that when you read about like different mayors and different governors, the only one that really pops up is the idea of the Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, who is going to have his Wisconsin plan, where you have local reform like Galveston, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Then Wisconsin starts incorporating a lot of reforms that come out of the Grange, and then they move to the national level. So not to be coy, but I think that there are, use your best judgment. If it seems like they're just kind of a one hitter and they're not really all that important, you should feel fine moving away from them. Alex, I see your question. Why did dollar diplomacy fail? I wouldn't say that it failed as much as it just was another layer of diplomacy that William Howard Taft tried. So when we think about what we do nowadays, we use all three of those diplomacies in our current diplomatic manners. Even though nobody really wants to come out and say it, like nobody really wants to call our military strength big stick diplomacy, but you can see the militarism that we had with Teddy Roosevelt and his Great White Fleet in the military that we maintain currently. It's pretty easy to see moral diplomacy with some people's arguments about why we should get into wars in different places in the world with the idea of spreading American values. And with dollar diplomacy, we've used the idea of inserting our economic interests into other countries to try to leverage them. What they do mention in your textbook, though, and this is what's making Teddy Roosevelt mad, is he went off on safari when he was done being president. He was our youngest president ever when he went in. And so he's still super young, and he made what he considered to be a mistake, where he said he'd only serve 2 terms. He was toying with the idea of serving 3 or 4, which is why he runs in 1912. But when he's done, he goes on safari, and then he meets all the world leaders on a world tour, and people are telegraphing him about how angry they are at William Howard Taft for him firing Gifford Pinchot and opening up national park lands, and what he's doing with monopolies and double crossing JP Morgan. And one of the things that made him mad is in Manchuria. Manchuria is just to the north of China. William Howard Taft decided to encourage the building of a railroad through that area after Teddy Roosevelt promised everybody, when he calmed down the Russo-Japanese War, he told everybody in the area, we're going to leave Manchuria alone. And then just 4 years later, you've got William Howard Taft in the presidency who starts building a train track right through that area. And the problem is China wants Manchuria, Russia wants Manchuria, Japan wants Manchuria, and they're all imperialistic in the same way we saw the United States being with Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam. So the problem with dollar diplomacy wasn't so much the idea itself. We still use it. It's more the idea of how he implemented it, where we've got a weird dynamic for our country that it's kind of hard for other countries to negotiate with us because every 4 to 8 years we change our leaders. And so like when President Trump became president, we had just created an Iran nuclear deal, and President Trump announced that it was a terrible deal and he ripped it up. He's got the prerogative to do it. It's just hard for foreign countries to negotiate with a country like ours, where when somebody new comes in, they have a new vision, they have a new strategy, and it could lead to a total departure from what was done previously. So that was the biggest failure for dollar diplomacy that we saw. Otherwise, with dollar diplomacy, what you saw with Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson is with the brand new Roosevelt corollary, Europe would get Latin American countries in debt. They would then use that as an excuse to invade. And then when they invaded, they would then be able to take control of the country, and they could say that they had to violate the Monroe Doctrine to get their money back. The Roosevelt corollary, which the dollar diplomacy is part of, argued that if a Latin American country like the Dominican Republic got into financial difficulty, Europe could still try to get their money back, but they'd have to go through the United States, and America would send its military into the Dominican Republic, take over the territory, pay back the Europeans. And it's actually giving America the excuse to expand its empire by taking over territories. So when you read the chapters for imperialism, notice how many Latin American countries get military interventions in them by the United States during this time period as a way to enforce the Roosevelt corollary. And you'll get a feel for then why there's tensions between the United States and Latin America. That's one of many different reasons why we have tensions. Hopefully then we're good. I don't see any other questions popping up. It's nice to talk with you guys. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, feel free to email or else see me before class tomorrow if you have any other needs. But I wish you the best of luck. I hope tomorrow's test goes well. Good night, guys.